All right, well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Paige Dobbs, who's an assistant professor of public health at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Dobbs' research focuses on the social factors that influence perceptions and behaviors among vulnerable populations, specifically regarding the use of cigarettes and e-cigarettes among youth, young adults, minority populations, and pregnant women. Lastly, Dr. Dobbs is the author of many different articles and has been published in numerous public health journals. So Dr. Dobbs, thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So just starting off, when did you first get interested in public health?
I got interested in public health after I got interested in tobacco advocacy.
Okay.
So I was in high school when the Master Tobacco Settlement Agreement, well, I guess it was technically right before high school. And so when I was in high school, our local coalition received funding. And they asked us to do a project. We did a survey of 6th through 12th grade students. And they said, here we're doing education for this group. Can you find it? If we're doing it, we're educating high school students about smoking. Right. And we found that students started experimenting with tobacco products about 8th grade. So if they didn't start earlier, and it was a fun project that led to kind of in college, I wanted to start a tobacco-free group. And then after college, I worked for a tobacco-free group, and it was that job that led me back to graduate school. So public health came second.
Wow. Okay. So that's really interesting. And so since you were in high school, you were already interested in this subject of, sort of combating tobacco in society. And so how did that develop?
That was wild. I feel like a lot of things sort of landed in my lap in the right way. I wasn't the lead, oddly enough. My brother was, and he doesn't do anything in tobacco today, so it's all his fault, is what I tell him. But I was kind of just part of the group and thought it was a fun project. I never imagined that one day I would still be conducting surveys here,
Sure.
20, 25 years later.
Yeah, no, that's pretty wild. And so I guess in like the historical setting, like describe what was happening with tobacco at that point in time when you were in high school and you're first becoming aware of the issues going on that would carry on, for many years.
Yeah. Well, another was my mom was a health educator growing up, and she taught at a local community college, and she would test her lectures out with us as children. So one of my earliest memories of her lectures was she took a Coke liter bottle and she put a cork in it and a cigarette, and she pumped it to show that smoke went inside the bottle as well as outside of the bottle. So it demonstrated smoke goes in your lungs. And I thought it was it was something memorable. Obviously, it stuck with me for many years. And so when I was in high school, the Master Tobacco Settlement had just passed, and states were receiving all of this funding. And so millions of dollars are going to states. States are determining, is this going to improve our roads? Is this going to be used for health? And so Arkansas was one of the few states that did allocate funding for prevention. And so also for research and other areas. But one of the ways was to develop local coalitions. And I lived in DeQueen, Arkansas. It's a tiny little town, about 5,000 people. And they applied for a grant to have a project coordinator who did programming and ideally for youth. So it was cool to kind of be a part of that the information that we helped them put together, they used to apply and get grant funding for the area. And by saying that, I was a very, very small piece of that, and I understand how small it was, but it was lasting. And that's why I think it's really fun to include youth in this process, because they just learn a little bit about it and decide if it's something for them.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense as like a preventative measure as well, educating people early on about the risks involved. Now, for people that are listening that aren't too familiar with the settlement that went on, can you describe what exactly happened?
Yeah, so in leading up to the 1990s, the tobacco companies had not lost a lot of lawsuits that had been brought against them. They had been quite successful in being able to deter and say, well, there isn't enough research and create doubt. And it wasn't until the 90s that they started to kind of lose some of these lawsuits. And so 4 states in particular came forward, and then all states jumped on board and onto what became and still is the largest lawsuit that's ever in history, any country, anywhere. and they put all the tobacco executives on trial for the death and disease that is caused by tobacco. And so part of the litigation that you can look back in videos on YouTube, it's most interesting, is the tobacco industry fought firmly that they did not believe that nicotine was addictive, and they didn't believe that they created a product that was addictive to people. Now later, after the agreement, and we acknowledge that they settled, so the lawsuit would have been more money had they not have settled. Now states are still receiving millions of dollars every year from this, and part of it is because states quantified how much they are losing in productivity, meaning that given a workforce, meaning what is that they spend on healthcare costs. And so in that lost productivity, states are saying we are losing more money because of your product than what we can sustain with our state, Medicaid, Medicare product or programs that we have. And so part of that is to come in. Now, not all states use the funding in the way that it was intended for that, or some used it to improve their roads. Some said, this is millions of dollars, we're going to use it however we want. But some did pour it back into, say, their prevention programs and their research that is focused on how are we preventing people from using tobacco. And so there's this double-edged sword that is still going on today. So tobacco profits are also put back into prevention. However, we acknowledge that they're still, this wasn't a prohibition, and many people would argue that a prohibition wouldn't work, would only cause more problems. But this was the solution to fund to try to prevent people from using, and also helping people quit. So state quit lines as well are often funded by master tobacco settlement dollars.
So, I mean, it's so interesting when you talk about like this journey with the tobacco, industry and society, and then, trying to combat it, and the settlement involved. And, it's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because then today, now all of a sudden there's this thing with e-cigarettes, and it's kind of like deja vu almost, because like, didn't we just get through a situation like this in society? And now sort of the world's been reinvented, and we have e-cigarettes. So when did you first become aware of like e-cigarettes? When did that become on your radar?
Yeah, I was working for a tobacco-free coalition, and it was in 2010. My dad was a dentist. My mom always worked. She worked any job in his office that needed to be done. Yeah. And she called me from a dental association meeting, and she said, there's these people here who have this, they're calling it e-cigarette. And she said, they said it's safe. And I said, step away from the booth, step back. If you don't know anything about it, step away from it. And so that was kind of the first time. And it was not long after that before I saw, especially in small towns, these little vape shops start popping up. And so some people think that that's kind of when it started. Really, the first e-cigarettes were sold in the United States in 2007. The first was developed by a man from China who was trying to quit smoking in 2003, but it took a little while. They went to the Europe markets, they came to the US in 2007, and they started to kind of build a little bit more traction by 2008, or sorry, by 2010, but they were as early on as 2008, 2009. They were on the show The Doctors, and they were acknowledged as like the century's most novel public health advancement. And so they were framed in a really positive way. Yeah. And it wasn't until 2016 when they were finally determined to be, the Deeming Act said that they were regulated by the FDA. But it started about 2011, 2012, which is oddly, so cigarettes were not regulated by the FDA until 2009 was the Family Smoking Prevention Act. That was by President Obama. And so we spent think about all of that time. Everyone was kind of like, who's going to deal with cigarettes? Like, oh, it's your problem. Like the FDA should do it. No, someone else, someone else. So the FDA kind of got landed with e-cigarettes, or so with cigarettes first. And then same thing happened with e-cigarettes. It's like no one knew what to do. Like, whose problem is this? And so they determined in 2016 that it would be the FDA. Now it took until just in the past few years that the FDA made any ruling on anything to do with e-cigarettes. And a lot of that came what we saw in 2019 when the E-Valley cases started happening, the e-cigarette and vaping related lung injuries, which were largely linked back to vitamin E acetate, was a component used to break up THC. So there's a lot of argument there as well, but that's when a lot of attention came on e-cigarettes. Was people who were watching the news probably saw them every night in the fall of 2019.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember like in high school, just seeing people starting to vape and use the e-cigarettes, and I think like one thing that seemed to be popular was that it was harder to detect than like using a cigarette, and obviously it didn't have all the health issues connected to it that people were aware of, with cigarettes. And I remember just seeing people like could do it in class or something really quickly, and it just seemed like it kept getting more and more popular when I went to college and everything else, and seeing more people use it. How did this become such a popular thing?
That's a really great question. So and when we look back, what I love is there's a couple of historic books about cigarettes and tobacco. Alan Brandt, who's a historian from Harvard, has written The Cigarette Century, and then there's also Robert Proctor has The Golden Holocaust. And these books lay out so well what the tobacco industry did to market their product. So we look back, and they didn't just simply go out and say, like, this is cool, let's make this cool. And because when you understand, I say so much of looking back at cigarettes, because when we need to understand e-cigarettes, we have to look at our history with cigarettes because they're parallel.
Yeah.
The strategies aren't new. The playbook is the same. And so with cigarettes, Lucky Strike, they made the color green popular. They went to Fashion Week and they found out, what does the color green mean? And they tied it in with women's rights. They went out as women were marching in the streets for their right to vote. And they said, because at the time women couldn't smoke in public. And they're like, you really show them, it'll stick it to them like smoke while you're walking down the street. And so they did. And Lucky Strike later said that they gave the color green to their army, and then they picked up the color red. So if you recognize the color red with Lucky Strike, that's where it comes from. But when we look at e-cigarettes, especially Juul, I think is the most notable, mainly because they've been under suit, and they've now been sued by a couple of states. But they use such similar tactics. They didn't make it about this cool, it's a cool thing to vape. They made a sleek device that looked like a USB drive. Yeah. And then they went to bars and clubs and they passed them out to people, and it became, can I take a hit off of this? And the next thing, then they made tricks where people put multiple together, and they were, how many hits can you take? And it was about everything else. But the slick device is one thing that when I interview people over and over, they talk about when it starts with Juul. Now, Juul also quickly became the target of litigation and of some of the policies in there. And like one of the things is, people will say the biggest compliment you can give somebody is to copycat. And we've seen plenty of copycats, and we've seen other devices that have just built off of the idea of Juul. Yeah. But e-cigarettes are something that escalated quickly. And
it's, it seems like it took off pretty fast once I started to see it. And then a couple years later, it was just kind of everywhere, and you would see someone with it, all the time. And it is kind of disturbing though, also because, it's really just seeing kind of history repeat itself with, as you were talking about, the marketing techniques are the same. It just makes you wonder, like, why were we not prepared to catch this? If we've already, as a society, seen something like this before with just traditional cigarettes, why did this take people off guard? Why are we not paying attention to what the cigarette industry, was doing in the background to reinvent themselves? Because I can imagine that, okay, eventually with litigation or something, e-cigarettes gets regulated more and more, and they're kind of crunched more and more. Then, okay, are they going to try to reinvent themselves again? What's the next thing? So, how is this happening? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that those are really good points, and I think that all the time of we've been here before. But what's interesting is all the strategies that have worked before with deterring youth with cigarettes don't necessarily seem to be working with e-cigarettes.
Okay.
So a study that I did when I was at the University of Oklahoma was first authored by Dr. Marshall Cheney. Was one of the things we asked students was about, for example, the FDA had a campaign that was about cigarettes being the industry kind of tricking you. They're your bully. It was a bully campaign. I don't know if you ever saw any of them, but they were like, cigarettes have bullied you into handing over your cash, and they bullied you into doing this. And it was supposed to be this loss of autonomy, because they did studies with youth and said autonomy is really important to them, looks are really important to them. So they also said, they take, it's more than just the cost it takes. There's a girl ripping off her skin was a really gross one. They did like handing over their teeth. That's like your teeth get rot out, and all of your skin. So all of the fear tactics with that one, but the loss of autonomy really hit home with kids that, oh, I don't want a company telling me what to do. And the Truth campaign was right behind that. Yeah. The Truth campaign built on that of that you've been tricked. And so you've just been a mouse to the tobacco, and you've been in their pawn. And so that was what e-cigarettes, they thought, okay, well, we'll just remind them that they are being tricked into giving extremely high doses of nicotine. And so very quickly, they're not making a decision. It's taking over their life. And for some reason, it didn't work. When we interviewed these college students when I was at Oklahoma, they would talk about like, oh, well, the industry is kind of smart to do that. And so we were like, well, what about the Marlboro? The umbrella company that owns Marlboro is Altria, and Altria bought a third of Juul. And so we said, what do you think about that? And they're like, oh, it's smart. It's a good business move for them. They own the cigarette and the e-cigarette. And so they own all sides of it. And it didn't seem to bother them.
Yeah.
And we were surprised. And again, it could have been that it was, kids in Oklahoma versus kids in another state. But the indifference of the same attitude that we saw in the past to cigarettes to e-cigarettes was kind of novel in that sense. There's also this loss of an issue, this normalization of addiction. And that was part of the marketing that was done around e-cigarettes, was just one more piece of chocolate, just one more Netflix, just one more, and then just one more hit on your Juul. And so it was, make it normal. Being addicted is fine. Everybody's addicted to something.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's a unique tactic. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, I mean, I guess you could like, what's the difference? Okay, if you're addicted to this or something else, you're gonna be addicted to something. And, yeah, I also just wonder if it's just easy for a generation that didn't grow up with sort of cigarettes hanging over their head to just get addicted to something else, because people fundamentally don't seem to change necessarily from generation to generation. There's always some new issue each generation that may have some resemblance to a previous issue from a different generation. I think we see this in many different aspects of society, that it's very hard for people to make those connections to the past, to present things that they're dealing with. And they just kind of like, well, it's, it's this different world. This is my life. It's a different time. I'm not worried. But it does seem to just kind of keep repeating. And it seems like e-cigarettes has emerged to be a pretty big issue in society as a result. Are like the rates of people using e-cigarettes increasing or decreasing at this point? What's the status on that?
So the increase in use is definitely among a younger generation.
Okay.
And so, which is at the same point, we can say that cigarette use is falling to an all-time low, has recently started to stall out. And so there is the argument, and our community, I will say our tobacco research community is completely divided. That part has been really difficult to see. So Stan Glanz is one of the biggest names in tobacco control research. And he recently retired from University of California at San Francisco. And he has been on the side that e-cigarettes are bad and they're targeting youth and we shouldn't allow them. At the same time, there are people who sat at the Master Tobacco Settlement Agreement who were against tobacco, who were, leaders and pioneers in tobacco research, who are now sitting on the other side of the aisle to say, well, these can be used as a cessation device and we should recognize them and their ability to help people, because they will argue that our fight is with tobacco. Our fight is with cigarettes. It's not with e-cigarettes. They're less harmful. There's a harm reduction potential. Europe
Right.
and largely has embraced e-cigarettes as a harm reduction potential. Now, I would argue that e-cigarettes in Europe are far different than those in the United States because they have caps on the amount of nicotine that they can have in the device.
Yeah.
And so the most that they would have, I believe it's 20 milligrams per milliliter, and the most that's advertised in e-cigarettes in the United States is 59 milligrams per milliliter.
Wow.
So
Okay.
we have a lot more nicotine in ours. But it's been pretty interesting to watch, like our divide in our community. And so I think that it is always a balanced approach of acknowledging that I'm not going to say, I would never say that e-cigarettes are more harmful than a combustible cigarettes.
Sure.
However, when people say we don't know what it will do to us, we're starting to learn. And nicotine in itself is a vasoconstrictor. And so it makes logical sense, is now we've seen some longitudinal studies that e-cigarettes and e-cigarette use alone, so not dual use, but compared to someone who wouldn't use anything, will increase someone's rate of having a heart attack.
Yeah.
And so I think those, it's also really interesting to talk with, a lot of my research focuses on young adults, and to talk to them about have they tried to quit, and many have. And they talk about it. It's like, what is the challenge and what is it like? And what they describe is so similar to cigarettes. They're coughing up phlegm. They're doing, and so the chemicals are there. They're in much lower amounts, but they're still there. And the nicotine is higher. So it's, that part, like you said, it's the same story as people who were trying to quit cigarettes. But there are also many are very proud of the fact that they only use e-cigarettes and that they don't smoke cigarettes. They think they're disgusting. They're gross.
Wow.
And they'll talk about like, oh, I would never touch those. And they're like, but I hit my e-cigarette every 15 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And some will acknowledge that. They're like, I have smoked cigarettes before. I vape more now than I ever did with a cigarette, because they said you have to go outside with a cigarette. You have to light it. You have to smoke the whole thing if you're going to, or you put it out. And they're like, my vape is it's constantly there. And I can do it inside. I can sneak at work. I can do it in class. Like you said, it's concealable. They can hold even the vape, like those who don't want to make big clouds or trying to sneak it in class can hold it in their mouth until it dissipates. And so no one knows. It doesn't smell. There's not the stigma that's associated with it, like cigarettes.
Yeah, it just kind of seems like like a more modern, hip version of a cigarette. Is just for the 21st century. So
it is. It definitely is. It's all the same signs and symptoms of someone who would smoke a cigarette. The agitation if they don't have it. And I think that's one of the areas that I'm really interested in, is this dependence that this young group very quickly is having, and their difficulty in quitting. So to what level? Some will talk about they switched to, in one study found that they were switching to regular cigarettes after college, or after kind of this young adult emerging age, that it was cheaper. And at this point, they're addicted to nicotine, and they just decided it was cheaper to smoke cigarettes.
And so I think, if I understand you correctly earlier, you're sort of mentioning this idea of sort of when people are trying to combat tobacco, there's kind of two camps. There's one that's just like, okay, let's go after, cigarettes, but also this new thing with e-cigarettes and try to, control that. And there's some that's like, well, I'm really focused on the cigarettes. The e-cigarettes, I'm not as worried about, because I guess for some, it's like, well, e-cigarettes are still better than, taking a cigarette. And then I guess the question is, though, to what extent, though, are lots of people that have never smoked a cigarette smoking e-cigarettes, and that's becoming a new big issue? Is I feel like a lot of people I knew that classmates or whatever in high school and college, none of them were actually cigarette smokers. They were just smoking e-cigarettes and then getting addicted to that. And I was like, this is not normal. This isn't some prevention from cigarettes. This is just a new thing. So to what extent are we seeing that?
Yeah, that's one of the areas of my focus. So we are seeing that. And I think that's where in 2019, when the Valley cases were rising and youth rates were rising, we were using the National Youth Tobacco Survey every year. I mean, it's more than 100% increase in the prior year. We started to acknowledge that, more than half of high school students had tried, and about 20% were current users of e-cigarettes. And these were not kids who had smoked cigarettes before. They were clearly not trying to quit smoking.
Yeah.
And so that became this talk of, this is the next generation of smokers, because they're getting addicted very young and it's carrying over. And around that time is when a lot of policy started happening, and I think that was, now that we said, okay, things are different now than they were with cigarettes. The FDA does have regulatory authority. Now it's limited. So in December 20th of 2019, President Trump signed what was a spending bill. It snuck into a spending bill, but a tobacco 21 law. And then the next month in January, the FDA announced a flavor ban on Mod Pod devices, not all devices, but just Juul lookalikes and Juul.
Right.
And so that was, I think, what was different. So at that time, I would say the divide in the community was very prominent up until about the fall of 2019, because at that time, there was this outcry of, now kids are dying in hospitals from what at the time they didn't know. I was teaching a class, and every class time we would come together to talk about what had happened with the Valley cases and what they thought it was. Now, by the end of that class, we knew it was vitamin E acetate, but at the beginning of the class, we did not know what it was.
Right.
And so I had students who thought vaping was really funny when class started, and then by the end took it much more serious. But our divide in community, there was a conference, a tobacco conference, and they said it was probably the first time people looked across the aisle and said, okay, I get you a little bit more. One of the reasons was they were talking about banning e-cigarettes entirely at the time. And so people kind of, to say, the prevention side was saying, well, is this what we wanted? We've been advocating, we don't want kids to have it. Do we want it to go away entirely? Or do I think that people, there are some adults who are using it? The same for people across the aisle. We're saying, if I don't recognize that kids are getting a hold of this, then adults aren't going to have access to something that might help them. So it made us all maybe appreciate the other side. And I think largely some of it because of who we researched. I don't read my research focuses on those kids, the ones that didn't smoke cigarettes and now use e-cigarettes. I don't study adults. I don't study the ones who've been smoking for 20, 30 years and are now trying to quit. So I recognize that somebody is researching that group, and they want every resource available that could help them. I've gone into vape shops before and talked to the staff there, and many of them kind of feel like they're a last resort. Like, these people have gone to their doctor, they've tried other things, and nobody's been able to help them. And so a lot of these people feel like they are there to help people quit smoking. Now, at the same time, they have no qualms selling to the kid that walks in who also just wants the next flavor. They're there for everybody. But many of these people they feel like this is their part of their job, is helping people quit smoking.
So what exactly are the sort of statistics on that? How often do people actually quit smoking from, vaping?
There was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed that people who used e-cigarettes were more likely to quit than people who used NRT, or nicotine replacement therapy, like gums and patches. The problem with their findings, what also been criticized, was at a year later, most of those people were, like 80% of those people were still using an e-cigarette. And so
Right.
the argument was, well, with nicotine replacement therapy, you're not intended to still use it after. There's a process and there's of weaning off of that, so you get off of nicotine entirely.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a one big study, and there have been, the other studies have been mixed. There have been plenty of studies that have shown people aren't any more likely to.
Yeah.
Either they relapse back to cigarettes or they're most become dual users. Actually, most just use vaping when it's convenient, and then, or e-cigarettes when it's convenient, and then they smoke when they can.
Yeah. I guess that's one of the kind of big issues when, especially like a new topic's being researched like this, is that trying to gather enough data to make a clear-cut decision is really hard, since there's so much research that still has to be done, I guess, to figure out, okay, what's the best way of going about this. So when it comes to, I guess, analyzing the youth and their usage with e-cigarettes, what exactly are the laws for different states in terms of how old you have to be to use e-cigarettes?
Yeah, so part of my research has focused on tobacco 21 laws. And so all states are now tobacco 21 because of the federal law. But 38 states have passed their own tobacco 21 law. And the reason that we call it a minimum legal sales age law, and the focus there is on the sales. So these laws emphasize that retailers cannot sell to youth. Now, some of these states include what we call purchase laws, sometimes purchase, use, and possession, or PUP, and they penalize youth who are trying to purchase.
Okay.
So those are very different laws, because a retailer, the first time, it can range, like in California, it's much more severe than, say, Arkansas, for example. But in states, the first time, it's often a monetary, it can range from like $100 to $1,000. Second time, it increases. Third, and now many states have what we call laws that can suspend their license or revoke it. And so suspension or revocation of a tobacco retail license would mean if you continue to sell to youth, then we're just going to take your license from you. The problem with that is that's an additional policy that not everybody has, because not everyone has a tobacco retail license. For example, Virginia doesn't. And so they can't revoke or suspend a license if they don't have a tobacco retail license. So there's so much with tobacco policies that there's little pieces that well, they need to have this in order to implement it in this way, and they need this, and they need to, most states don't do, and what they really should and could do is just say how many inspection or compliance checks, or what we call it, where there's sting operations where they send a youth in and they try to purchase tobacco, and then if they sell it to them, that's when they get the penalty. They often don't say how many they have to do per year for retailers. And then in some, they claim, they said, well, there's no way to do this many. We have so many retailers in our area. That's a problem, because now retailers know that they're not going to be checked. And so what is the incentive to comply with the law when you don't think that anyone's checking you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. All these different rules and regulations depending on where you are, and yeah, that's always an issue.
Yeah, I love one part I love about teaching in college students is because I get to ask them, and they're like the exact right population. So when I was at the University of Oklahoma, I asked my students, I was, what do you think about tobacco 21?
Yeah.
And somebody said, I said, well, I was in the gas station the other day, and this guy pulled out his driver's license to get carded, and the cashier said, oh, I don't care. That's a stupid law. I'm not going to card you. And so I was like, these are the moment, like, this is what's happening. And we can create the best policies, but we have to implement them. And so they have to be written in a way that they can be implemented. Oddly enough, Oklahoma, it was where the senator, with a sign-on agreement that says states have to, they have to meet these standards, and it's supposed to be 80% of their checks have to be in compliance, so they're not selling, or else they could lose block funding. Now, some of that, then they recognize if they were doing this honestly, no state would make it. So they now left it up to states, and so part of that is states want to do good compliance checks. At the same time, they don't want to lose block funding from the federal government. So there's some interesting pieces with that. And even though, so I said 38 states have passed the Tobacco 21 law, those states that haven't, they still have to sign our compliance checks. Their law just might be outdated, and say like the decoy, we call it, I don't like the term decoy with it, but the youth purchaser that goes in for a compliance check, we often want to say like their age, old laws have them at the age of 15. And when I worked for the Tobacco Free Coalition in Arkansas, it was now more than 10 years ago, one of our jobs was to work with schools and find youth that would do these compliance checks. And at the time, it was a 15-year-old that looked like a 15-year-old.
Oh boy.
And so, yeah, and now because it's 21, some states have written in that the decoy or the underage purchaser needs to be between 18 and 20 years old.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, thinking about the sort of comparing and contrasting cigarettes and e-cigarettes, what would you say are like the main differences that people should know between the two when it comes to just trying to understand them?
Yeah. E-cigarettes do have chemicals, and often many of the same chemicals toxicity reports will show they're in far lower amounts.
Okay.
And so if someone were able to completely switch, if they could stop using cigarettes altogether and use e-cigarettes, yes, I firmly believe that they would probably see a health benefit. However, they should have a goal of quitting all nicotine. And reason for that is heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States, and that we know that e-cigarette still increases your risk for myocardial infarctions. But thinking between those, cigarettes they're lighter, and I'm now kind of thinking in behavioral and use and how people have described them who've used both. To me, have described, they said, cigarettes, you can just use 2 fingers and you can just puff on it. And I've talked to cessation counselors where they said, people have talked about that they had trouble quitting because they said, I can just hold my cigarette with my mouth. I don't even have to do anything. They said, I can keep a cigarette in my lips all day because I can just hold it there. E-cigarettes, the same people said, you have to hold an e-cigarette with your hand. I'm like, they're like either holding a tank device. It weighs more. And then that's another what a person said, I can't hold the e-cigarette, it falls out of my lip. And so, these are people who are extremely dependent on cigarettes. So there are those challenges. Another is when I was in a vape shop recruiting for a study one time, and I was listening to the person working there talk with someone about quitting, and it was interesting to see how they talked about the voltage needed to be right, and they needed to try the menthol kind because it was going to hurt the back of their throat. The hit was going to feel different. They needed to cool it. And there were all of these things that sounded super technical. And I was like, well, I believe you. I'm fully on board. Whatever you're saying sounds very official. But another thing is that smokers, especially smokers for a long time, their lungs are weaker. And now we've introduced moisture into their lungs at the same time.
Yeah.
And so pneumonia becomes, a conversation of concern. For youth who are using, I think the biggest concern and the difference is people played with cigarettes thinking, or I shouldn't say what thinking, they often, it came from their family. Like when you were in high school, people's parents didn't smoke e-cigarettes when they were kids because it hadn't been around that long.
Right.
The only ones who were the ones who were trying to quit smoking. Kids who started smoking, they did because everyone in their house did it.
Yeah.
So it's like you said, it's this changing of society. Will vaping be that you just see whole families vaping together? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like in 20 years.
Hopefully not. Yeah.
I do think that we're starting to see e-cigarette evolve into generations. We call them generations and devices. A first generation is like the blue, that first came out had the blue tip.
Right.
And then we saw the second generation, then we saw the box mods and the mech mods, and then we saw the fourth generation Juuls come out and the disposable devices now. And so there is a difference in people, and that's part of the research. That's something I'm doing right now. There are different types of people who use the box and the mech mods than there are the people who are using the Juuls and the puff bars and the disposable devices or the pods that you can change. We've already seen that evolution happen. So what I think from now, is are these people, fundamentally different? How will marketing change for those people, or will it just identify that's the market? Will vape shops still be around in 20 years, or is this just a fad for now?
Yeah, that's something I guess always going to wonder about is it going to still exist, or will it evolve into something else? And it does seem like if there's a way to make money off of something, especially something that's highly addictive, then it seems like there's always a possibility that something else can come out and be utilized. I mean, I wonder, I feel like there's been an increase, for example, in like the amount of sort of like hookah places in the US. I think before in like cities, you didn't see that as much, but I think there has been more and more popping up, which was something that you typically didn't see in the US. If you traveled maybe to Europe or obviously in the Middle East, you would see it. But in the US, that was not something that was popular, but I think it's becoming more popular, at least from my observation. But I wonder if that's something else that is going to be on people's radar. I don't know, but
it does seem, there's definitely. So one of my mentors is Dr. Brian Primack. He's the dean at the University of Arkansas and College of Education and Health Professions. And his research has looked at hookah use in the past. And there definitely seems to be a relationship between e-cigarette use and hookah. Now, e-cigarettes are a type of electronic nicotine delivery system or delivery device. So there are e-hookahs, which are different than e-cigarettes. And so it's interesting. A lot of times though, you see it like an e-hookah place, they may also sell e-cigarettes and so have this dual function. And so it makes sense that this community is still, in the same place. And it kind of those who, it comes back to many times of like the reasons. What are the reasons? So is it just a recreational fun thing to do, which is incredibly scary during COVID, of thinking about, at a time when we would like to wear masks, and then there's people communally sharing a hookah.
Right. A social gathering. Yeah. Yep.
That was one of the first things about Juul that I thought about was when we would interview people, they talked about Juuling was a generous culture. When you went out to a bar, you just shared your Juul. And some people would talk about they had lanyards for theirs because if they didn't, it would pass around a group and it would be out by the time it made it back to them.
Oh my gosh.
And so then they would talk about like, it's too expensive. And I'll never forget, there was one participant who talked about that she wouldn't Juul in front of her friends because if she did, she knew that they would ask to hit puffs off of it and she didn't want to share it.
Wow, that is fascinating. Oh my God. So it really is, it's like I guess it can be like a communal thing, like whether it's like marijuana or something like that, or hookah, where people just share their Juuls around. Okay.
Yeah. And I think the same people who would say like, I don't want to share my marijuana blunt because I'm in a state that it's hard to come by or it's expensive,
Okay. Yeah.
and or the same people who'd say like Juul pods have gotten really expensive and I don't want to share.
It's the price. It's not the fact that you're spreading these germs or potential viruses.
Yes. that by and large, almost everyone that we talk to, they mention price.
Yeah.
And they all will like automatically come up, or not all, but a lot of people will come up and say like, well, I would stop at this price, but then they'll kind of negotiate a little bit higher. Well, if I could get a mango, I would pay $5 more and pay $10 more. And that's precisely what's happening with college students. So this was before Tobacco 21, but wouldn't be surprised if it's still happening. They have group me messages. They have little groups that they sell in their communities. One of the most alarming was there was a group in Oklahoma City that was going to do research with Juul, and they had a contract with Juul. So Juul was going to give them a whole bunch of free devices, and they were going to give them to homeless people to try to help them quit smoking.
Okay.
And this all happened right around the time of Tobacco 21. And there was someone from that group that I said, you do know, like, kids are using this like a lot. I mean, they'll trade and they'll buy and sell, and they'll even sell part of a pod if they're out on campus and they can't get one. And they were like, really? And I was like, yes. And they were like, oh my gosh, we're doing this homeless study that you think that homeless people would sell it to the kids. And I was like, without a doubt. Yes, definitely. That's definitely going to happen.
Oh my gosh.
So I think those are also kind of like ethical points in research, and why we have to think about why we don't accept money from tobacco industries for our research. I think that is a big conversation right now. And that's a historical point. We saw a tobacco research society headed up by a man who had been president of the University of Maine, University of Michigan, who we historically have seen the tobacco industry did this. They created a research council, and their job was to create doubt around existing research.
Right.
And some of the even statisticians that we still know and use their, procedures today, their job was to just simply create doubt. Causation, correlation does not cause causation came up a lot in the argument of tobacco. So that, I think, what's happening today with e-cigarettes is we're seeing great and phenomenal researchers who have accepted funding, who are working as consultants with e-cigarette companies, and they're doing just that. Juul bought out an entire supplement of the American Journal of Health Behavior, and people who have been known for being tobacco advocates are now sit somewhere in the middle of a gray area that I think it creates doubt.
Wow.
So those things I think are interesting, and it kind of goes back to that divide in community. And Juul's been the most notable because they will approach anyone to offer them money. I've been approached by people who work for Juul at our Society for Nicotine and Tobacco Research Conference. They've offered researchers up to $100,000 to conduct research about their product.
My gosh.
But and when they're at the conference, once you figure out who the Juul people are, you see that they all talk to each other. They're international, from all Juul all over the world. And I was working in the lobby area, and I overheard some people talking. I kind of looked and I saw it was the Juul people. So I start eavesdropping, because that's what you do. And and I heard them say, did you get him to sign an NDA? And then I realized that was their whole point of coming to the conference, was to get as many people to sign NDAs that they would conduct research without publishing anything negative about their product.
That's crazy. I mean, it is also, I guess, just shows kind of a major issue in American society in general, also, where, companies can completely, try to combat all actual research that's done in a truly scientific and objective way, just so they can try to protect their profits by manipulating, the conversation as much as possible and get away with it. I mean, it's almost functions like a mafia type organization. Like, okay, I'm going to pay you off. You're going to come work for me, and you're going to make everything look good on our side to protect our business. I mean, it's crazy to think that this is allowed, but
yeah. And it's an interesting, because that's probably one of our biggest and best tobacco conferences that we have, but it's been nearly impossible to keep the industry out. And so they've acknowledged, because they can't be a member. They can keep them from being a member, but they can't keep them from coming to the conference. I've been also American Public Health Association conference is the largest public health gathering in the country. Before COVID, we'd have anywhere around 15,000 people who would be there at any given time for the conference. And there was someone who worked for Altria, and we tend to like always see each other. And he's going up and he's just taking pictures of people's posters. And so kind of like the research I'm talking about, a lot of it is like, what are reasons people use e-cigarettes? What kind of brands do we, well,
Oh my gosh.
APHAs be careful to not say brands, but they're
Right.
like, what are things? So he's just going up and just snapping picture. And I thought, e-cigarette companies don't have to do research. They can come and use ours. We are doing research that's benefiting the industry right now by them. We're trying to figure out how to not get people to use it by understanding their behavior. They're trying to how accelerate it.
Yeah.
And so I saw him doing this. So I jumped out in front of him and I started telling people at posters, like, this man's he's from Altria. He's taking pictures of your poster. You can tell him that he can't take a picture. So
Yeah.
he walked up to me and was like, so I noticed you doing this. Why are you doing this? And thankfully, right when he did, I stepped in front of a poster of Kelvin Choi, who works for the National Institute of Health, who is just an incredible researcher. And
Right.
Kelvin did just an excellent job of reminding him if he wanted to create a cessation device, he's more than welcome to take his product to the FDA to get it approved as such. But because it's currently not, it doesn't have a cessation device.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like a spy basically trying to, like, how can I benefit the company? That's crazy.
Yeah. And his name tag didn't say Altria, it was initials. So that's exactly what it was. It felt like he was a spy at a public health conference to get as much information as he could.
That is crazy. It's like, to think that this stuff goes on, but I mean, it makes sense that it happens, but it's just so under the radar for people not working in that field, that, you know, people would never think about stuff like that. But you could see how this could happen in many different fields, you know, where people have a profit versus public health. Wow. So how do you go about combating, you know, companies trying to take advantage of the conversation and, you know, will just basically sell their souls to get people hooked so they can make profits? You know, what do you do to try to fight that?
Yeah. Well, and that is a great point of some of what we can do as national organizations with some of the work I've done with people. We have to first identify, I like to say, you have to know who your enemy is. And so those in research have to first disclose if you have any funding, if you receive any funding. I think that we put pressure on national societies and journals to make sure that they're not publishing that work, only because there's a conflict of interest. And, you know, someone might do something and find that there, you know, is significantly less of this, but it's hard to say that this person is providing everything. Now, one of the things people can say, you can make numbers, look at however you want. You know, you've a large enough sample size, you can find almost anything is significant. The problem with that is some people who intentionally don't publish something aren't telling the full story.
Sure.
And part of being a researcher and, you know, wanting to protect public health, you have to also publish what you find. And it may not make everyone happy, and you have to describe it in a way that, you know, that's true to the data, but you have to do that. People who are signing non-disclosure agreements aren't doing that because they've agreed not to. So some part of that, I think, is we can put on our national organizations, on our journals, our peer review journals, acknowledging if any reviewer or any author has received funding, and then making really firm policies about not publishing that. And I say that because many of our journals are publishing some level of it right now. And there was an editorial in one that talked about that they had, for the second time ever, published a paper that was funded by a tobacco industry member.
Yeah.
And so they justified why they do that. And they were like, you know, for the American Journal of Health Behavior, the past owner of that journal had described that, you know, we publish stuff for people who accept money from pharmaceutical companies. So how is it any different? The research should be pure, research should be research, and we should focus on that. The problem with that was that there was $53,000 that was spent to make sure that entire supplement was about Juul, everything from paying reviewers to review them faster. So that, to me, raises red flags of conflict of interest. So yeah. I think research, that's the stance we can take as research, is making sure that we aren't publishing research that may have a conflict of interest. not allowing members of industry to be in our national organizations because they don't deserve a seat at the table. And I know that's really harsh, but they have manipulated people and policies and corruption, and it's well documented.
Yeah.
The same companies that did this for 100 years are now own e-cigarette companies. So we can't say, oh, that they've learned their lesson. No, they're back in courtrooms because they haven't. And for that reason, they shouldn't be included in creating policy, and they shouldn't be included as the good guy at the table, because they're not.
That would be the logical thing. Yes. I mean,
that would be.
That's crazy. Well, changing the subject a little bit, what are you currently working on?
A lot of things. No.
Yeah, okay.
So I have different buckets of, it's all generally focuses on e-cigarettes. Some using social media data to look at policy discussions.
Okay.
And so I just had a paper accepted that was about the miscommunication of Tobacco 21 on Twitter.
Okay.
For example, when it first happened, there was this big spike of people who are talking about, what's going on with Tobacco 21, because it had been in prior bills as early as April of 2019, but they snuck it, Congress snuck it into a spending bill in December. And so it passed very, very quickly, all really within a week, and was signed into law the day after it passed, was passed by Congress. So that paper talks about how the policy on Twitter, even by news stations, was described as a purchase law, and it's not. And so people are like, oh, good, these kids are going to get in trouble now. No, the kids aren't by the federal law. And I would argue that they shouldn't be, because it was like dangling candy. And then as soon as they took the candy, we slapped their wrist for it.
Right.
The law just says you can't sell to kids. So if we prevented people from selling to the kids, then we're going to stop a lot of it. Now, I acknowledge that there's definitely always going to be kids who sell to other kids, but fewer 17-year-olds know a 21-year-old than they do an 18-year-old, because they're in school with someone who's 18.
Sure.
So yes, sorry, I was trying to remember your question.
No, that's okay. Yeah, just different, current research.
Doing.
But yeah, it sounds like
so social media stuff is kind of one. And then I've got a study that's going on right now that looks at e-cigarettes and distress intolerance. And so that one's actively collecting data right now, which is really cool. We're doing interviews, so this is fun because it's the first time I get to talk. I've been doing lots of interviews where I don't talk for a long time.
Mix it up now, yeah.
So that also looking at how people tolerate their distress, especially, or how e-cigarettes tolerate distress. And I also have a really great group of graduate students. I have 4 PhD students in my lab. And so we do some different things with like theory, and looking at how theories can be applied to help understand e-cigarette use. And they're also doing just incredible work in different areas. One works for a federally qualified health center, and she's looking at how we use social determinants of health to look at health outcomes. Another is using social media to look at postpartum policies in hospitals. And then I have another student who he is looking at a bystander intervention for sexual assault prevention. And so I say that some of my research it focuses on a theory or focuses on a method. And so in that terms, it can branch away from e-cigarette use. And I had people who did that when I was a student for me, that they weren't particularly interested in tobacco, but I could learn something about how they did or what they did, and apply that to what I was most interested in. And so I can do that back with students now.
Yeah, that's cool. So obviously you're involved with lots of different things. What would you say is the best way for people to sort of keep track of your research and what you're doing?
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that it'd be fun if people would. One is if people, I was at a conference once and someone said, how do we get access to your articles? Because, they say you have to pay for them and things like that. One is ResearchGate. If
Okay.
anybody wants something and you go to a site and it says you have to pay for a research article and you say, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. And nor should anybody pay $30 for an article. Go to ResearchGate and you can message people on there and say, can I have a copy of yours? They can privately send it to you. They can email it to you if you want access to theirs. Also, PubMed is just a database that people may go and search for articles, but yeah.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's yeah, a really fascinating topic. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's really an honor to be on your podcast.